Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We had our virtual vendor booth with InSinkErator from 12:30 to 1. So I'm just going to give those people a minute or two to switch over to our webinar. We'll get started in a couple minutes. Kendall and Nora, I'm just going to turn your cameras off just for this intro part, and then we'll turn them back on for your portion.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started. So as I mentioned, we just had our virtual vendor booth with InSinkErator from 12:30 to 1. Thank you for everyone who attended that. And so now we'll move into our webinar portion of today's event. So as some of you may know, this is part of our New York State Organic Summit webinar series. This is our final webinar of the three-part series. And it's on managing wasted food, lessons learned nationally, and New York State's plan of action. So this webinar is being hosted by NYSAR, which is the New York State Association for Reduction, Reuse, and Recycling. They are a professional organization within New York State that focuses on recycling, composting, product stewardship, and extended producer responsibility. As you can see, I've included the benefits, and you can join as a member and you can receive those benefits. As part of NYSAR 3, there is a New York State Organics Council, and this is a group of professionals within the larger association that focus specifically on organics. We have a number of different working groups, and if you're interested in this, you can reach out to Jesse Kearns. His email is there. And I should also mention that this webinar will be recorded, and we will be sharing these slides afterwards, so you'll have access to all of the links mentioned in the presentations today. So as I mentioned, this webinar is part of the three-part webinar series for the New York State Organic Summit. Thank you to everyone who's been a part of this. The first two webinars are now up on the website, and they will also be sent to those who register for the webinars tomorrow. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with the New York State Organic Summit, it's an annual event that happens every year, and it rotates around the state. And it's just a chance to bring together materials management professionals in New York State. And while we won't be having one this year, we will be having one next year, and we've booked the venue already. And so the date for next year is going to be April 6th to 7th at the Albany Capitol Center in Albany, New York. And so COVID may potentially come up on today's webinar, but I just wanted to point out that the U.S. Composting Council did do a webinar series on composting in the time of COVID-19. And as I mentioned, so afterwards, when you have access to this PowerPoint, you can go back and watch all of the presentations there. And so before we get started, we're just going to hear a couple words from one of our gold sponsors, Eco Products. So now we will hand it over to Toby.
Thanks, Christine. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for attending this webinar today. Special thanks to the presenters and NYSAR for making the switch to a virtual platform so we can continue to advance reduction, reuse, and recycling in New York State. Can you flip that slide for me, Christine? Eco Products. Eco Products advocates for zero waste. We are a mission-driven company dedicated to this cause. It's baked into our vision and mission statements. We produce an annual sustainability report that's unmatched in the industry. We're also a certified B Corp, validating our mission-centric approach to our business. With our certified B Corp status, we join the likes of Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, and Seventh Generation. Next slide, please. The Eco Products difference. Eco Products has the largest bundle of environmentally preferable food service packaging available on the market today. Our Eco Products commitment to innovation keeps us on the cutting edge of product development and sustainability expertise. Operator specialists provide in-market knowledge on regional composting, recycling, and hauling resources. local to national policies impacting our category, and the system solution to waste diversion. We're also an industry leader in advocating for broad change of the way society manages its waste. EcoProducts provides a host of sustainability and marketing services for free to help operators get the most out of their investment in green food service packaging. Next slide. EcoProducts advocates a system solution to waste diversion. To achieve waste diversion rates higher than 50%, front of house composting is necessary. If procurement buys only compostable packaging, it's easier for guests to put the right stuff in the right bin. The facility can service and clean the building more quickly. Haulers can trust that contamination will be minimized, and ultimately composters can easily identify compostable products they trust, knowing that contamination will be minimized and they'll receive more food scraps that come along with the packaging. Thanks for listening and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Toby. So now we'll move into the webinar portion, Managing Wasted Food, Lessons Learned Nationally and New York State's Plan of Action. And also just like to take a moment to thank all the sponsors who sponsored today's webinar and the activities of the New York State Organic Summit. And as we go through the presentation, please feel free to insert your questions into the questions portion of your panel through GoToWebinar. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Kendall to set the scene for what we'll be talking about today. Just make sure Kendall's unmuted here. Okay.
Good. Thanks, Christine and Toby, and to today's audience. My name is Kendall Christensen. I'm a longtime member of NYSAR and its Organics Council through my consulting practice, Gaia Strategies. I'm based in Brooklyn and work closely with the city's commercial waste and recycling industry. But over the last 15 years, my work has taken me all over the US and Canada, engaged in discussions with states and cities about managing organics as a resource. Now, as meetings and conferences like this summit have moved to the internet, over the last 2 months, I've monitored probably more than 25 webinars on various aspects of the food waste challenge, from the UK and EU, some from Canada, and many by various US groups. Most focus on food recovery and distribution, with the vital goal of feeding people and reconfiguring conventional distribution chains from restaurants and cafeterias to the consumer market. Several have focused on home and community-based composting as individual actions, and some examine systems. At the risk of overuse, the word pivot is the central theme. Just 10 years ago, when food waste as a municipal waste management issue was just beginning to percolate, the number of groups focused on this issue was relatively small. Food banks focused on food recovery, and compost biosolids and biogas associations focused on those sectors. But prompted by EPA's development of the initial food waste hierarchy and comprehensive reports like REFED, now this sector is huge and growing, from microhaulers to depackaging to anaerobic digestion and biogas to developers of all kinds of technologies. And laws and other policies have helped drive that activity. Now, the COVID pandemic has expanded the discussion about food waste management in the public consciousness, crossed over into the popular media as we shelter at home, rediscover our kitchens and cooking, stock our pantries and freezers, and refocus on fresh instead of prepared foods. I grew up in the Midwest, one generation off the family farm, with on-site composting and home canning of fruits and vegetables a regular family project, which my wife is now discovering with their first batch of strawberry rhubarb jam this weekend. So the question for today's speakers is the role of state and local policy in providing the framework for all of those initiatives. We will look at states that were pioneers in developing an initial set of laws and regs, as well as those that have come to the table more recently. We will ask what's worked, what can be learned from elsewhere, and how current and future laws and regulations can keep pace with the fast-changing activity in this area. We will focus primarily on the Northeast with a sidebar look at California. So our first speaker is Nora Goldstein, editor and publisher of BioCycle, who's known to many of you, I'm sure. Published since 1960 and now moved entirely online, BioCycle is recognized worldwide as the Bible for its authoritative coverage on composting, organics, recycling, AD, renewable energy, and community sustainability. I recently saw a catbird in my Brooklyn backyard. Through its publications and semi-annual conferences, Nora's been in the catbird seat overseeing organics management for nearly all of her life, and we're pleased that she's joined us today. So I have an initial set of questions to talk through with Nora before we take yours. And I'll start with the first one. Is Nora, looking primarily at the Northeast, remind us of how Massachusetts, Vermont, and Connecticut led the way, and what did the initial wave of laws and regulations attempt to do?
Sure. Thank you, Kendall, and thank you to NYSAR and our friends at New York State DEC and everybody who joined today. Welcome. It's kind of cool being a Northeaster that the New England states took the lead and developed these various approaches to legislating or regulating the stopping food waste disposal. They all took different approaches. Speaking of the three states that Kendall mentioned, Massachusetts's commercial food waste ban, which is a regulation and not a statute, grew out of a long history within its state solid waste management plans. They had banned a number of materials from disposal, and food waste was, the commercial food waste was sort of the more recent one. And Connecticut went with proximity and quantity, the quantity generated provision, similar to what New York State has done. And Vermont's is a totally different approach. It's included as an inclusive universal recycling act, which also addresses all the materials on the recycling side, as well as yard trimmings and food scraps. Of those three states, only Vermont includes a residential stream, and Vermont is also the only state of those three where the compliance ratchets down to basically zero food scraps to landfills, the last horizon being the residential sector. I went back this morning just to see what sort of the impetus was in these various states. I can't remember what Connecticut's was, but I found articles in BioCycle. Vermont's was a stagnant recycling rate, along with the fact that it was down to one commercial landfill in the state within its borders. Massachusetts came, again, that history of bans within their solid waste management strategy, but also when I looked at this article, it came out of a clean energy framework. So very early on, this was 10 years ago, within the confines of clean energy. And then California, on the other hand, which Kendall mentioned, we take a side glance at, totally born out of greenhouse gas reductions. So there's all ended up doing similar things, keeping organics, food waste out of the landfill, but from different vantage points.
So Nora, often these laws are sort of passed sort of with great aspirations, with goals and objectives that may or may not be realistic, but they sound good in the adoption phase. Looking back, sort of what's your assessment about how they've worked in practice and what kinds of tweaks have been done over the last few years?
Yeah.
And then looking at New York and New Jersey, with the newer laws, how they've been informed by the experiences in the neighboring states.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's really important in answering this question to keep the intent of these legislative actions in mind. And one of them is to stimulate infrastructure development, organics recycling infrastructure development. And these bans have essentially definitely acted as a stimulant in infrastructure development. Another was that if you build it, they will come. You're going to get this flow of organics to the facilities and to digesters and composting facilities. That has not necessarily happened. It doesn't guarantee a feedstock flow. And another was it'll help facility developers get money to funding to develop these projects because there's a law behind it. And that also hasn't necessarily come to fruition. For some funders and lenders, they're mostly interested in a long-term contract for food waste coming into the facilities. And that may or may not, it certainly helps when having these bans, but it's no guarantee. As far as tweaks, I think most significant, and New York State's new law embodies that, is the inclusion of language for edible food recovery and donation. California's SB 1383 actually has a 20% edible food recovery carve out baked right into the rule. And New York State obviously has the edible food recovery element to it. And while the original laws weren't as explicit with food recovery, it was almost an immediate cause and effect, because when generators started looking at their waste streams and doing the audits, they very quickly discovered how much edible food they were throwing away. And it led to two primary things, one being to source reduce, to be smarter in their ordering. Another was to repurpose more. But then the really amazing thing that happened out of it was this increase in food donation and recovery, not just of the perishables and then the dry goods products, perishables being produce, but also with caterers and restaurants and universities, the ability to donate prepared foods that had not yet been put in front of the consumer. I just want to make one more point about what also was spawned, and I think the ReFed innovator database and then their accelerators. There has been so much innovation in the food recovery sector, not just in ways to facilitate donation, but also in the upcycling of food, new products that are using food that may not want to be served right away out in a restaurant, goes into all kinds of secondary uses. And then I was laughing because my mother got an order during the COVID, this situation with produce from Misfits Produce. And that's like become a big business now, these produce that don't look beautiful. So the other thing, Kendall, I just wanted to mention is shortly after, or even it may have been part of the plan in Massachusetts, the state DEP worked with the State Department of Health and stakeholders in really developing food donation guidelines. So much of that legwork for states that are just now getting into it exists, and really so important not to reinvent the wheel, but really to tap into the experiences of these early states.
Well, you pointed out a couple of the initial barriers that weren't necessarily anticipated, which was the inability to get sort of feedstock guarantees and financing and all that sort of stuff. Subsequently, have any of the states sort of figured that out or made any of those sorts of tweaks? And I appreciate you mentioning the innovation. I'm remembering that years ago, as I was watching this field develop, I was predicting that at some point there were going to be food fights over who had access to food waste, food scraps, whatever. And are we seeing that develop now, where there's sort of competition over feedstocks in a way that hadn't been anticipated before?
Yeah, it's interesting, because one of the reasons I think we see more organics recycling facilities and or the haulers are getting into setting up depackaging systems. So essentially, they're taking food with either more contamination or food that is packaged but can't be sold. And part of this whole, it's the low-hanging fruit, the clean pre-consumer streams, the back-of-house materials very quickly got spoken for, and so as you look at what else is in the waste stream, you're finding that there's this whole other tier, and therefore we've seen, like in a state like Massachusetts, has close to a half a dozen facilities for depackaging that are either in transfer stations or located in that. And that's for two reasons. One is to take on this more complicated food waste stream that's got packaging in it. And the second is to consolidate, because in a state like Massachusetts, much of the processing capacity may be a little more distant. So they're transporting in tanker trucks to those facilities.
Well, as you noted, so far the state laws and regs have mostly focused on the larger volume generators, food-related processors, institutional, operations, commercial businesses, but they've not really focused on residential or household organics. California, I guess, is now an exception to that. You mentioned Vermont is headed in the direction of residential food scraps as well. Could you just sort of comment on how you see that developing and what's sticking or what still has to be worked out on the adding residential to the mix?
Sure. And so we did a survey back 2017 of residential food waste collection access in the US. And this is a survey we had done a number of times previous to 2017. And there's definitely a steady growth in municipalities that offer residents curbside collection and dramatically increasing drop-off collection of food scraps, residential food scraps. And so it's happening, but nowhere at scale, barely at scale. And I don't know truly what the reason is that we're not seeing the residential stream targeted, other than it's a burden that falls directly on local municipalities. And sorry, I was getting a bit of an echo there. It falls on, that they have to bear the costs of it. What we have seen is that municipalities that do curbside collection of yard trimmings in the bigger carts, they add food scrap, they'll allow food scraps to be added in, calling those ride-along programs. And Kendall, I don't mean to backtrack, but I realized in the question you previously asked, I buried some of the answers that I wanted about lessons learned and laws, and there's just a couple of points I want to make before we run out of time. And it's truly one of the things we've seen, in addition to the innovation around food recovery, is the innovation around decentralized infrastructure, where you can roll out food scraps collection and diversion at the community or neighborhood level. So community composting, all kinds of cool collection services, some subscriptions, some that have morphed into becoming contractors for municipalities to do collection. This has just really been exciting to see. And in a way, they're serving the residential households more so in some cases than the straight out municipal services. But one also thing that's really important to remember in New York State, and I saw this in some of the questions that registrants had sent in, is there is no silver bullet to managing food scraps. And it's just not possible to produce compost in 24 hours or even 5 days. But we do have gold standards, and these are the best practices that have been developed over many, many years, that we know how to do collection, we know how to do processing, we know how to market compost. The system gets hung up around contamination on the market side. So I think it's just important to again tap into that experience. There's not one solution to making this work well.
Well, you mentioned no silver bullet, but there is a gold standard, so you've got to work bronze into your next answer. So.
Yeah, how about it? That's right. There is bronze. I'll think of it.
Good. Well, I want to shift a second to talk about what's happening on the WRF side, though, with water resource recovery facilities entering the food waste game, and whether or not you've seen any policies, regulations, incentives, whatever else that have helped that to develop, or whether that's just developing more, shall we say, sort of organically as that sector sort of gets more interested in the access to food waste as a resource for its biogas production and the like. Any underlying policies or laws that are making that happen, or is that what's driving that?
Sure. So it's interesting. I looked up an anecdote that I wanted, a case study that I wanted to share, because what we've seen happen is, well, it's a couple of things, but I don't want to give the example of the Central Marin Sanitation Agency in San Rafael, California. The wastewater treatment has anaerobic digesters, but it wasn't until the city manager, who had gotten information that there were grant monies available from a utility to institute projects that would lead to greenhouse gas reduction. And so the city manager called the wastewater treatment plant and said, hey, I know you have digesters there, and I know we're trying to deal with food waste. What do you think about the idea of sending food waste to the digesters? And very quickly they got involved with the hauler and organics collection service that coincidentally was right down the street from the wastewater treatment plant. And now they have a dedicated receiving area at the treatment plant for food waste, and food waste to digest, and wastewater treatment digesters or farm digesters is a high strength waste that really increases biogas production. So that's led more and more treatment plants to look at their adding in food waste streams, and in many instances, these plants have capacity to take it because they were built with capacity to service industries that are no longer there. Policy-wise, it's really interesting. There are, to my knowledge, there are no policies that overtly connect sending food waste to wastewater treatment plant digesters. It's kind of happened over time, and there's an adaptation curve for treatment plants. The one policy that people were counting on was the renewable fuel standard, which is a federal act that EPA administers to increase the amount of non-fossil fuel, renewable fuels in regular fuels. And they created these categories of what those market values were. And food waste, when added to a dairy manure digester or a wastewater treatment digester, actually have a much lower value. And it's a complicated thing, and anybody can email me and I will send you articles on this. But it's almost become a disincentive these days to use digesters for food waste.
So it's been mostly opportunistic so far, as that segment of the food waste battle has sort of been developing. You mentioned an article. You want to sort of tease the list of articles that you put together?
Thank you. Thank you. I knew I was going to forget if I didn't mention it right in the beginning. Just in conversations when looking at the questions and the scope of today's webinar, I pulled together a bunch of articles that Christine is going to post in the chat, and they all have links and hooks. Oh, they're already there. And for example, I saw one of the questions that registrants had was around residential food waste collection programs, and so we just added in the 2017 survey findings. And yeah, we have articles on the renewable fuel standard, the what they call RINs. So I was just saying before the webinar started to Kendall, there is so much information in our archives, and really hope everybody gets our weekly e-newsletter, Biocycle Connect, and goes to biocycle.net. But I know we have one more question, so I'll stop.
Good. Well, there's the plug, so you got that in good. So this is a crystal ball question, sort of looking ahead at what might be coming in the next several years. I'm speaking from New York City, which is just suspending several of its organic diversion programs because of fiscal stress. Got any crystal ball for what's coming next? I know we got New York and New Jersey yet to fully launch their laws, and we'll see what that turns into. And I guess also, is there a viable EPR angle to food waste that's permeating the discussions around other types of recyclables? But this extended producer responsibility question, I've struggled with how that gets applied to the food waste issue, and just curious if that's you've got any thoughts about that.
Sure. Well, my crystal ball is bursting right now with the market opportunities for compost. For many, many years, Biocycle has said the markets have to drive the diversion, because if we're only competing on the front end and we have to compete against landfill disposal and very traditional practices that are really embedded in the US and in many other countries, it's a struggle. And you're going to have situations where, in the case of New York City, where the budget gets cut and programs are sort of left trying to figure out what to do. But if it's a markets driven situation, opportunity where we build in, there's a market value for compost, but more so the recognition of the benefits that using compost brings, and biogas and renewable natural gas, but compost is an easier example. It's key to really, whether it's key to climate resilience, it's achieves carbon sequestration, drought tolerance, more drought resilience, better management of stormwater, and the list goes on. What we're lacking, and what our crystal ball must have pulling us forward, is much more overt procurement requirements for composters so that their markets are more secure. This is taking into mind that we're producing high quality composts that don't have contamination. And what's really, really important, Kendall, is inserting ourselves into this national conversation on regenerative agriculture and healthy soils. It is daily that things come in, press releases about companies, big food companies that are building that in. And we've just had this series of articles by Sally Brown and Biocycle Connect. They all build the case for all the reasons why markets have to drive. Well, we're going to need compost. So it's not necessarily driven by the need to divert organics as much as the need to produce compost and renewable natural gas and renewable power. As far as an EPR, I've always thought how cool it would be for all these consumer brands that want to achieve zero waste to really take that around full cycle and help to assure and secure infrastructure in a way that composters can really collaborate with brands, so that if we're talking packaging, that it is 100% certified compostable, and therefore you're going to facilities that can manage it that way and truly compost the compostable products the way they were designed. So it's going to take that level of effort, I think, for the EPR, but in the traditional sense of EPR, it's really more around, I would say, the consumer brands and the packaging.
Good. I should have added circular economy to that question as well. But I see from the questions that have come in, one that I want to jump back to, the California experience. You talked about greenhouse gas emission reductions being a principal driver of what California is doing. But that part of the discussion, is hard to track in other places right now. You've had some articles about how to do that kind of measurement and modeling. Anything you want to sort of add to the greenhouse gas emission aspects as a policy driver in California?
Could you be a little more specific in terms of the the compost use piece of it, or in terms of keeping the organics out of the landfill so you're reducing the methane? It's a methane avoidance.
As a policy driver, something that the state says they want to achieve by 1383 and are going to be sort of measuring results against, and how landfill diversion, soil regeneration, whatever else have all been part of the policy mix in California, but the greenhouse gas emission piece has been sort of front and center in ways that it hasn't been as much in the Northeast.
Absolutely. And so essentially that is all built around landfill methane avoidance. So when you're disposing of food waste in the landfill, the methane, essentially the food waste decomposes and the methane is emitted before the cell can be capped and the gas captured. So that's a very, that the EPA warm model has that measurement. And CARB, this California Air Resources Board, there's all kinds of formulas that show that. More recently, we're learning more on the carbon sequestration end of that, with how much carbon by applying compost to soil and then also adapting other soil health practices keeps the carbon in the soil. And one of the most recent studies out of the University of California, Davis, shows that when you use compost with certain soil conservation practices, it's the compost that gets deeper into the soil zone where the carbon is sequestered more. And I'm going to bungle that if I go any further. But it's and then on the fuel side, with the renewable fuels and California's low carbon fuel standard, that also has really concrete, mathematically detailed calculations for the reductions.
Good. Nora, I think we're at our appointed time for this part of the discussion today. I see a couple more questions that have come in that maybe we can answer sort of offline, but I want to thank you very much for your participation today and for getting us started with such a good overview of what's been going on the law and policy front. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
So as we set up for the next part of our presentation, we're going to take a short break and hear a couple words from our silver sponsor. Patrick Evans is here on behalf of the New Jersey Composting Council to talk about the launch of that chapter and the work that they're doing in New Jersey. Patrick?
Thank you, Kendall. So good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I want to thank the New York State Association for Reduction, Reuse, and Recycling, and all the sponsors and staff behind the planning and adjustment to a virtual 2020 New York State Organic Summit. It's honestly really great that we can still educate and make an impact virtually. So thank you for everyone for coming on this webinar. So as Kendall mentioned, my name is Patrick Evans, and I serve as the marketing manager for the New Jersey Composting Council. We are a small nonprofit organization and a state chapter under the United States Composting Council. We are driven to advance compost manufacturing, compost utilization, and organics recycling to benefit our members, society, and most importantly, the environment in New Jersey. That being said, we are very focused on building a coalition of dedicated members to help strengthen the organics recycling in the state of New Jersey. So we've had a very successful year so far, as we recently helped play a pivotal role in passing of a major food waste recycling mandate for large-scale generators in the state of New Jersey. So that's great that we've been able to play a role in that and then see what we could do with the municipalities further on. The slide just lays out all our contact information as well as our social media platforms. So please feel free to follow us and check us out, as we are pretty active on all these platforms. If there are any comments or questions about what more we do in membership, you can contact me at the email listed below there as well. So thank you for listening in, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of this webinar.
Great, thank you, Patrick, and good luck to our friends in New Jersey in the launch of the new state program there. So now shifting back to focus on New York State, we have with us Sally Rowland, who's the Senior Environmental Engineer at New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation. She's an agency veteran, as you all know. She oversees organics recycling and beneficial use initiatives through DEC's Division of Materials Management. And Sally has a presentation for us. Thank you. Sally?
Thanks, Kendall. I think agency veteran really means I've just been around for a long time. But what I'm going to talk about, as Kendall mentioned today, is specifically how does it work in New York State. You got a nice overview of what's going on in the Northeast and this little bit touch of California. Now I'm going to kind of drill down to New York State activities and a more holistic view of how we're addressing to reduce food waste, increase donation. Next, please. We tried to kind of think of it as what can DEC control at a state level, what really needs to be done to have a holistic program. So we kind of came up with this pictorial. As you know, most of these kind of pictures come from the web, but believe it or not, this one was actually painted by hand. This is a watercolor done by Nasima Elmi from our group. So we think it's pretty cool, but it's looking at, okay, if you're going to grow a plant, in this case, strawberries, because we have a tendency to like those in our section, what do you need? So what are the components of have a successful growth? Same thing when it comes to the food industry, whether it's recycling or donation. Obviously, outreach and education, regulations, funding, and if you have some legislation that helps you in that. We're fortunate in New York right now, we have all of these available to us. As many of you know, it's not always the case. You deal with what you have in front of you, but right now we're in a good spot in New York State that we have all these elements that DEC has available that we can use for this effort. Next, please. So we're going to kind of take them one by one. If we look at those components of growing our strawberry plant, we had a watering can, which we're representing here as the law. As both Kendall and Nora mentioned, we do have a relatively new law in New York State, unlike some of the New England states who've been doing it for a while, on food donation and food scraps recycling. You will be getting these slides, so you will be getting these links to help you find more detailed information. We have tried to learn from the other states and what they have done. We also recognize, as you all know, but sometimes we forget what these laws is, the law is passed by the legislature. It's not passed by necessarily experts on food waste. So sometimes you get what you get. But we're very fortunate, we think, in our law is something that we can work with relatively easily and something that doesn't have a lot of difficulties in terms of moving us forward. The bottom line is in New York State, and we'll talk about, this is not all of New York. New York is kind of a unique situation that it has New York City separate in many ways because they're doing their own thing, many things. But as of January 1st, 2022, what we call large generators of food scraps that are 2 tons a week or more must donate excess edible food and recycle the remaining food scraps if there is a recycler within 25 miles. And we'll talk a little more detail of what these things mean. Next, please. All right, well, what is what we call a designated food scraps generator, that large food scraps generator for our purposes? 2 tons per week on an annual average at a single location. It's kind of hard to figure out what does 2 tons really mean in practice. What kind of place is that? Is that a grocery store? We'll show you in a minute what that really means, we think. How do you deal with, this question usually comes up, how do you deal with a mall? How do you deal with a college campus or someplace where you have multiple generators? How our law is set up is it depends on who contracts for waste management. So if you have a mall where you have a large restaurant who does their own waste management contract, they're a generation point. If that mall has 10 small restaurants and the mall handles the contract, then the whole mall is at generation point. Same on a college campus. So that's how we're trying to tease out how we're going to deal with those. Our law does have some exclusions. Hospitals, nursing homes, adult care facilities, and elementary and secondary schools. Question always comes up, well, why? It kind of gets back to that, well, the legislature did this, we didn't. The thought pattern was that we were to handle these entities more through a outreach and education standpoint versus a mandatory requirement, and we're looking to do that too. New York City is a big one. Not because we don't want New York City, obviously, to do things, but because New York City already has their own programs in place. Interesting that right now there's a lot of unfortunate discussions, and it looks like they're heading in the direction of cutting some of the residential programs in New York City, but they have also a commercial program. And as far as I know, there is no talk of changing that. That's in law. So as long as New York City continues a commercial program, they're excluded from the state program because they already are doing what we would require. The other one is generators that can handle mixed waste recycling. We do have one facility in Delaware County, New York State, that can handle mixed waste stream. They can handle garbage off the curb pretty much because they have separation equipment. Obviously, if a facility can handle that, you don't need to source separate. They're few and far between, but we did want to recognize that that's a possibility. Next, please. As I said, how do we figure out? There's not a lot of data, or if there's little data out there, if anybody knows where to find it, we'd be thrilled if you share on really who does generate how much. So without having an actual database, and these facilities are not required to tell DEC or anybody else how much waste they generate, let alone how much of that is food waste. So what we do is we use these factors based on other studies. So we have worked with the Pollution Prevention Institute at RIT. They have helped us a lot on a number of fronts, education, otherwise, but looking at a number of studies to figure out, okay, what does this mean? How can we equate, is it square footage of the facility? Is it number of other number of employees? What factors makes the most sense? And they have found most studies have come down to a number of employees. So this is not finalized, but this is kind of in the realm to give you an idea of what we're looking at now. The number of employees at these entities, or students, if you will, or inmates, if you're a prison, that would equate to that 2 tons. So this is the minimum you'd have before you're kicked in as a designated food scraps generator in our law. Food retail, it's about 69 employees. Grocery stores, 208. So about any of your decent sized grocery store is in, that kind of stuff. And then you have obviously schools, residential. One thing you won't see here is some of the other generators. This is not all of them. There's no zoos on this list, airports, because it's so hard to get a factor for those. So those we're going to have to do our homework and kind of go one by one and figure out how much they generate, but they're clearly still under the law if they're a large generator. Okay. Food scraps, what's the definition? This always makes it difficult for different people in different states too, because the laws are different and their definitions might be a little different. In New York, it does include food contaminated papers. That sometimes comes up in other laws, but it's basically an edible food, food contaminated papers, and edible food that's not donated. It does not include fats, oils, and grease, which I believe is included in New Jersey and maybe some other states, not in New York. It does exclude residential. Of course, they wouldn't be a large generator anyway, but that's the law puts it in there. And recalled or seized food. Obviously, we have a concern, not that some of this stuff could still go to recycling. We're just saying because of concerns about what it's contaminated with or what, whatever, we're not going to mandate that it should. That may not be the best place for it. All right, what's an organics recycler? It's pretty broad. Rendering, animal feed, composting. As Nora mentioned, one size doesn't fit all. We didn't want to pigeonhole everyone into one technology. You can pick what's best for you. One key here, which is gonna some consternation to some, is resultant material must be beneficially used. It seems like an easy requirement. It is typically for composting. Where the rub for this one becomes is digestion at a wastewater treatment plant. We require, if the wastewater treatment plant is taking in food, that proportion of the biosolids must be recycled. It's not sufficient in our mind just to do we're all supportive of energy recovery, gas production, but it's not enough from organics recycling perspective. And we talked a little bit about, what's a single location, obviously the same control. If you have a college, it's not just every, part of the college, it's under that, whoever controls that part of it. Okay. As I mentioned, some of the basics, effective, we got a little leeway, which fortunate we think, because it gets us a lot more time to educate people and get people up to speed. So we have until January 1st, 2022 before our law kicks in. An important point, all these, what we call designated food scrap generators, all these larger generators must separate excess food for donation. As Nora mentioned, this is something that's come to the forefront, as well as organics recycling, that we want donation. So we specifically lobbied to have that in the legislation. So no matter what, they must donate. We recognize many of them already do. The grocery stores, obviously, in places like that, already donate. What we're trying to get at here is that there may be opportunities for additional donation. Maybe things that, again, as Nora mentioned, it's not just the box goods. There may be other materials that they generate that could, with a little bit more effort, could be donated as well. So we're going to be looking to them all for that. All right, after you're done donating, you are required to recycle your organic or food scraps if there's a viable facility within 25 miles. You could be doing it on site. You could be doing it at a separate facility. It really becomes up to the generator. We will be determining, DEC determines whether there's capacity within 25 miles of where you're located, and then you decide what option works for you. One interesting thing is it doesn't have to be the facility within 25 miles. Even though there is capacity within 25 miles, if you're, many times a generator, their dealings are with their transporter. So if your transporter says, okay, I'll recycle, but my facility is located 50 miles away, that's fine. You've still met the requirement. You're not obligated to use that facility. There are provisions for a waiver in the law. Basically, if you show that there really isn't capacity within 25 miles, a number of other reasons. The law doesn't specify a differential, but we're so far looking to probably use a 10% from a cost perspective, that it can be up to 10% more expensive than you're paying for disposal. For recycling, you're still obligated. But that'll come out, shake out to the rulemaking. Next, please. All right, so how do we measure 25 miles? It's interesting because we listened to New Jersey a couple weeks ago, and theirs is road miles. Ours is not. Ours is, as I say, as a crow flies, it's not driving miles. That's how we are interpreting our requirement. It's a little bit different. Have to have their recycler has capacity for the generator's food scraps, of course. A very small recycler and a big generator is not going to work. We have to have enough capacity to handle it within that. So if you do, again, you're obligated to do it. It's going to be a learning curve to make this all work, but that's kind of part of our job too, is to figure out what's out there. Of course, in New York, the law had a couple purposes. We're trying to get more donation, and we're trying to spur the industry. We're trying to facilitate some growth in the organics recycling end of things. Okay. And just an example, if you go to the P2I, the Pollution Prevention Institute, they have developed a mapping mechanism they call the locator that you can put in. It's going to be revised based on some new data, but it's still up there. Anyway, if you take a look at it, it has generators, has recyclers, has lots of good information on it. If you just pick a point, I just randomly pick a point, 25 miles southeast of Rochester, and you can put on different layers. This is organics recyclers. So if you know your generator, this can tell you, and you can pick on those and tell how much, what they can take, what kind of material, that kind of stuff. So we're doing a lot of this mapping stuff to help facilitate both our decision making and for the generators as well. Okay. Annual reporting, as you can imagine, DEC loves to get annual reports. So every year, and the law obligates the generators to report to us. We're trying to make it as easy as possible, just a simple electronic reporting. We figure this is probably 1,000 to 1,200 generators. We don't want to make it too onerous on anybody. And as I mentioned, there's a temporary waiver. If you can prove hardship or somehow you don't really, it doesn't really apply to you. It only can be a year in duration, but it can be renewed. We're going to open the first waiver submissions before the law kicks in next June to September, after we publish a list of who we think the large generators are. Okay. We did hold a bunch of stakeholder meetings last year when it was a thing you could do for transporters, recyclers, food donation, environmental groups, food retail. We're going to be doing a little further on. So as you can imagine, we're trying to kind of get a feel for everyone's level of knowledge of the law, what their input is, and helping us drive regs and other outreach materials and what have you before 2022 rolls around. Okay. From those meetings, we tried to get some, obviously, feedback, and some of the things that were, as you can imagine, if you would imagine coming out of something like this, we need more capacity, funding, outreach, and donation. We're looking a lot closer at how does that link between food banks and local food relief work? How can we make that work better? Logistics, addressing liability, those kind of things. And we're looking to many of these concerns. We're thinking it would be a good thing to start up a food donation work group to try to look at these in more detail. Okay. All right, what's next in growing our plant? Regulations. Most people don't think this is kind of a necessarily thing to do, but believe it or not, we do. It helps a lot when it comes to a law like this of how do you clarify what is required. It's going to be called Part 350. It's a new regulation. Implement the law. It's currently drafted, but in internal review. Some of the key issues, how do we deal with waivers? As you can imagine, how do we deal with on-site systems and things like that? If you're looking for the actual regulations for the recycling facilities, they already exist and they're found in 361. So 350 is just for the law itself. 361 is for the nuts and bolts of the technical standards that apply to organics facilities. Okay. All right, outreach and education. As you can imagine, it's hard to underestimate how much this is really needed. Again, as Nora mentioned, there's lots of material out there, and many times it's how do you coalesce that or find the right information. We can certainly help with that. We don't want to recreate information either, and we can help steer people to information they need. We're developing guidance documents. We do webinars, announcements. We have a web page. Again, you'll have the link. We have DEC Delivers, which is a newsletter that comes out that you can sign up for. You automatically get the newsletter. We do social media, education events. We, as I mentioned, P2I works with us on their website, has lots of information. BioCycle is a phenomenal source. So there's lots out there. Don't hesitate to go looking for it. And we can help you if you're looking for something specifically as well. Okay. All right, everyone's favorite topic as well. Is there any money available? Fortunately, believe it or not, we're usually not in this circumstance, but we do have some money. This is money we've already put out there in the last couple of years. This is from DEC directly. We funded 27 municipalities. This is just for food scraps related stuff. $3.3 million, 84 of the small food providers called emergency food relief organizations, 1.1 million. We have a contract with the Food Bank Association, which is now of New York State, now called Feeding New York State, to provide them staffing primarily of $800,000 to help for the 10 regional food banks in the state. We have a general recycling program called MWRR that handles all kinds of, bottles and cans, any types of recycling. We did use 1.2 million to take all the organics projects, the food scraps projects off their waiting list and fund those. And we did this kind of cool project with the Food Bank of Central New York a couple years ago, where we funded them to purchase a number of trailers that they they put in cooling systems so that they could bring them around, bring fresh fruits and vegetables, drive them, drop off a trailer at a distribution point so they could very quickly have a mobile system. And they've become very useful during COVID as well, as moving stuff quickly. There's a list of all the awards. You'll see that. Again, they're on the links. Just to give you a couple ideas, I go through these kind of quickly. What did the community things? It's kind of cool to see communities come up with a lot of neat ideas on their own. They're not all following the exact same pattern, and we certainly supported that. We funded this backyard composting guide in Ulster County. So we assist municipalities both on reducing food waste, donating food, and recycling. It wasn't limited to any particular activity, anything in that realm. Next, please. A couple other examples. I won't go in detail. Again, you can read them more at your leisure. Stuff from pilot curbside food scraps recycling for the town, volunteer networks, even vermicomposting, that kind of stuff. So again, every municipality may have their own idea what works for them, and it's kind of neat to watch them bring these things forward and be able to help fund them. Okay. The FROs, again, what we call the emergency feed. This is a smaller organizations versus the food banks. We decided we were going to fund the food banks kind of on a bigger scale, but why don't we try to go right down to a small scale to projects that could be, $1,000 with a little provider. So that's why we had 84 of these contracts with little providers. Stuff from this, the provide funding to increase, obviously, wholesome food. This is Pittsford, out near Rochester, the food cupboard. They were out receiving food from a local donation point. Again, these are small projects, but a lot of excitement, a lot of volunteer effort to make these things work with a little bit of money. Next, please. Some other ones. Composting systems. Obviously, you can have a FRO who's also involved in composting. They generate food waste as well, food scraps. You'd be hiring people. This picture again is the Pittsford food cupboard, the grand opening of their cupboard to help people out. Could be religious organizations like Catholic Charities of Albany. Could be refrigeration. Again, part of it was trying to get more healthful food. So refrigeration is obviously a big deal for fruits and vegetables. Okay. Couple pictures. If we start from the left, this is Catholic Charities Albany, a nice new refrigerator we bought for them. The one on the top are food containers in Messina up in northern New York, reusable containers for delivery to their clients. The one down at the bottom is a spinner. Basically, they wash and clean vegetables, and then they put salads and things like that in this commercial spinner to dry them out. And then on the right, the people peeking out, it's from Phillies Bridge out of New Paltz. This is a CoolBot. It's basically a freezer cooling room, but pretty low tech. Again, the kind of cool things about this is many times grants programs are huge projects or fairly big projects and big money. Here, even though it's a lot of work to get 84 contracts in place, it's a neat thing, or it can make a big difference with sometimes not a lot of money. So it's kind of cool to see these projects come together. All right, what's coming up this year, next year? More grant programs. We're trying to get more grants out there, both on the Muni side and elsewhere. We'll give you more details on this. Certainly, USDA has some money. P2I has some money. Interesting about P2I is P2I gets money from ESD, Empire State Development. And before they can fund on the private side, we can only fund on the not-for-profit and muni side of DEC. But P2I got money from ESD they're administering on the private side. The really exciting thing is they are expanding the scope of their funding so they can go beyond just helping a generator to helping food scraps haulers and recyclers. This is huge, again, for the infrastructure side. So those on the privates can look to them for potential funding. DEC on the muni not-for-profit side, we're going to have $500,000 for more muni projects this year and next. And we're using $1.5 million to help Feeding New York State. Part of that is COVID related to get some of that milk is being wasted on farms to those in need, and fruits and vegetables and other activities. Okay. Just a quick one to go through these. Yeah, these are not cast in stone. You know, if you work for government, nothing is done until it's done. What we're trying to do, many subcategories under these, but the main things, by this fall, get our regs at Part 350 out. This September, to have a webinar more on the updates of what's going on, to try really hard to reach out more to those generators. Next summer, June 2021, to notify the generators who they are, what they have to do under the law, work on that waiver process, and then be ready to hit the ground running in January when it kicks in. All right, so what comes with that, as I mentioned, lots of things. Lots of it we've already talked about. How do we get to those retailers? They're kind of hard sometimes to get a hold of. How do we assess the food scraps recycling capacity in the state? Some of it we regulate already, so we have some of the leg up, but not totally. Who's on the list? We're a little different than some other states' laws in that the DEC is required to list who they are. It's not self-implementing. We have to figure out who they all are. Again, as I mentioned, we're going forward with this food donation work group. We have for a number of years, but we're kind of trying to revive, looking at, because we have lots of yard waste facilities in the state. How can we kind of entice them through technical assistance and other means to look at food scraps as an addition? So many advantages going to an existing facility. And again, as I mentioned, working with facilities that may be exempt from the law, but either interested in or certainly could participate in recycling of their food scraps. And how do we deal with enforcement? It's always a fun job. Okay. There's lots of ways to contact us. Again, if you have questions, feel free to. We have a specific email address for the law. We have one more in general, but feel free to ask us any questions. We're pretty good. We are very good at responding. And you can sign up if you click on that link to receive announcements about what's going on with the law. And also a link to our webpage. And we can certainly help you. There's lots of information there. I'd also add, go to look at P2I as well. Thanks.
Sally, as always, that was a terrific and comprehensive presentation. As an industry veteran, it's a great way to sort of cap your career and using all your wisdom and experience to help this new thing get launched in the next couple of years. So I know it's been a little bit of a hiccup with the pandemic inhibiting what you can do in terms of meetings and the like, but you got an ambitious schedule ahead of you. We've got about 20 minutes left. I'm going to start with 2 questions and then take some off the questions that have come in from listeners. The first is that you made a passing reference to how other states, and since we're talking about laws and policies here, other states have slightly different definitions of this or that, or approaches to one thing or another. Is there any conversation going on in the region now about how to sort of harmonize what the states are doing in this region to make it easier for companies and institutions that operate in multiple states, or is that yet to come?
I think that's yet to come. Some of it is depends on where you're coming from. Since ours is a legislative, we only have so much leeway to change what's in there. Some of it can be done as we do a rulemaking. So as we do that Part 350 rulemaking, we may have some wiggle room to look at that stuff. But sometimes it's difficult because you're kind of stuck with what the legislation says.
Okay. And the second question is about enforcement. Can you remind us what the law says about enforcement or what's being contemplated in the draft regs?
The law specifically doesn't have any specific enforcement provisions, but it is under the environmental conservation law, solid waste section, if you will, Article 27. So there are general enforcement provisions that apply to anything in that section. So we're trying to work out what the details are going to be now. We certainly have the ability to enforce, but it becomes, what format does it take? Does it start with a letter? Does it start, that kind of if we find someone's not complying. So that will be developed over the next year. We don't have a formal policy yet.
Okay. I see a bunch of questions that are being asked that you answered in your presentation about resources and help and funding and the like for companies that would like to get engaged in this business. I see a particular question about whether office buildings are covered. And again, not counting New York City, obviously, as being exempt so far from this, but office buildings in other cities in the state would be covered or not, or it's based on what they generate?
It's based on what they generate. Yeah, they are covered, but they would have to generate 2 tons. So their cafeteria would have to be fairly good size office park. But yes, technically, if they generate 2 tons or more a week, they are covered.
Okay. I see one question that is sort of timely because of the pivot that we talked about earlier of food that used to go to restaurants and institutional cafeterias now going to retail, but the packaging is different, and whether or not that is causing any problems that you've heard about in terms of food donation because of the different kind of packaging.
It's causing big problems in terms of, yeah, certainly from the donation end, but even more from the generator end, because it's backing up the system where back to the farm who may be going to a processor that only packages for restaurants had such a reduced need that it's backing up to the farm. So now the farm has excess milk. But we're working with the food banks, and certainly they're doing a lot of stuff on their own with the producers and the processors to try to be able to distribute that material through the donation system. So there's a lot that's being done because obviously nobody wants to see that milk wasted or the fruit and vegetables wasted.
Okay. I see a question asking about why New York City is exempt from the law. I know the answer to that, but do you want to take a shot at answering it?
Yeah, they're only exempt because they have their own law. If they did not, then they come under the state law, but they still do, even because it's on the commercial side. Obviously, New York City's commercial law is still in place. Their proposed cuts are on the residential institutional side. So as long as they continue to have their own law, but if they ever, rescinded that law, they would then fall under the state law.
Okay. Well, let's see. A lot of these are pretty particular questions, but you should be quick to answer. One is about in diverting food waste to anaerobic digesters. Digesters don't really want the soiled paper. So how would a generator sort of comply with the overall law if the place they're sending it to doesn't want that segment of the food waste stream?
Basically, they would be obligated to do what that facility can handle. So if that facility can't handle waste paper, they wouldn't have to separate waste paper. So yes, if it's going to a digester that only wants the food itself, then the generator would be required to separate just the food. It really defers to what the recycler can handle. That's what the obligation is going to be on the generator side.
So would they be required to send the soiled paper then to a composter, or you're not going to get that not going to get that in the weeds in terms of?
Yeah, I don't think initially we're going to go that far down the chain.
Okay. Good. Let's see. Question about stakeholder meetings on Long Island.
Certainly for the foreseeable future, we're going to be doing things online, but once we get doing them live again, we certainly will be doing them in other locations in the state. It could include Long Island. We haven't planned out that far, to tell you the truth.
Okay. Christine, I don't know if you're still listening, but I'm looking for other questions here that we should touch on. Anything that pops up for you?
Also just scanning through here. Yeah, I guess for Sally or for Nora, if you could just talk about any plans for statewide mandates of residential organics collection. If you think that's something that states would ever take a stand on. I know Vermont is approaching that, but just any thoughts either of you have on that?
I know in New York, unlike Vermont, we don't have any ratcheting down in our law. Our law is 2 tons per week. My hope would be in New York that if this is successful, that we could go back to the legislature and certainly advocate for going further, smaller amounts. But it's a ways down the line for the state as a whole.
And Nora, you still with us to say anything about that, or?
There we go. Sorry, I was muted. I don't see any mandates coming down the line on the residential side other than the couple that exist. At least I haven't heard of any. But time will tell. And we do have a number of, well, actually, no, in the residential side, I'm just thinking there's only a handful of cities that have mandatory participation in their food scrap, curbside collection programs. So nothing I've seen in the crystal ball shows that. But what's exciting, again, when you go back to these subscription services and more community-based initiatives, they are really engaging more and more households in the practice. And so if and when communities or policies look to do mandates, I think, we'll have a population that's excited to participate.
Yeah, and I think the overall sense of these laws and regulations is to jumpstart this sector and create the capacity to handle these materials, and that once that's developed and those facilities can operate, maybe more economically than the other disposal options, is it will help attract other materials that may not be necessarily mandated, but the economics will start to make sense. Christine, I see a bunch coming in now, so.
Yep, I was also just going to add, we've received a couple questions on compostable plastics, bioplastics. And Nora, I know you had put out the top 10 composting trends of 2020. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of speak to some of the trend that's going on with compostable plastics right now.
Sure. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about these products, even though they've been around for many, many years. And the most important takeaway is they really need to be certified in this country. That certification is done through the Biodegradable Products Institute. In our surveys that we've done, both on the residential collection and then 2 years ago on the food waste composting infrastructure, one of the bigger challenges is that there aren't that many composting facilities that will take in certified compostable products. And the biggest reservation they have is that it invites lookalike products that aren't 100% certified compostable. And so there's this hesitation. It's better, almost easier in some ways, to default to food waste only programs. But when there are a number of composters who do allow them and who do accept them, and in many cases they also administer their own organics collection programs, so they're on the front lines doing the training. And so you're seeing their lists of products that they know works at their facilities. So those are the ones that they allow their customers, that are in their organics collection programs to use. These products do break down. One of the things that sort of compounds a challenge is you have more and more composters who are using shorter composting times, less time in active composting, and equally important in curing. So part of what we encourage in those situations, if you are taking those materials and you're pretty sure that's all you're getting, is to put them back into the front of the system, because they do break down. We're going to be having an article very soon on a great study done in my God, I'm blanking. I think it's the Netherlands, that they analyzed a bunch of these products in a composting system. They also really examined the materials coming in. They did a whole separate sort on the different kinds of plastics. And I think that will really, it provides good data points for us to continue this conversation.
Nora, for you, I know you've written about this as well, or Sally has, but can you talk about the PFAS issue with respect to composting?
Mm-hmm. So these unintended consequences that impact organics recyclers to no fault of their own. And one of the PFAS is essentially a family of fluorinated compounds, and I can never get the names right, but PFAS is sort of the general category, and then there's PFOS and PFOA and all that. But essentially, these are the chemicals that you see in flame retardants. They are popular because they're, lipophobic and hydrophobic. In other words, you can use them for packaging. It's why the grease doesn't spill all over your car seat if you're getting takeout, or if you're eating in your lap, the bag doesn't soil your clothes. But these are compounds that don't really break down much in the environment, and they are shown more in the aquatic systems versus the sort of the solid waste side, that they do pose health problems. Most recently, or I should say more recently, we've seen in fiber-based packaging for food service that they're in there, and in some compostable other products. And so the Biodegradable Products Institute a couple years ago basically set a limit on the content of a PFAS type chemical. And now it's fully in effect. And so you're seeing compostable products companies, including Eco Products, which is a sponsor here, introducing products that do not have these fluorinated chemicals. It's a big issue on the biosolids side. Happy to talk to anybody offline, or the Northeast Biosolids and Residuals Association has really taken a lead nationally on this. And so important, as always, you've got to really look at the level of risk and what is truly posed as a public health and environmental impact versus more of a perceived. And Sally Brown has written some really good articles for us on that.
I knew we would get a biosolids mention in there somewhere, so at this 11th hour. And one more. Have you, now that we're 5, 6, 7 years into this in the region in particular, anybody done any job studies of how many jobs have been created by these laws and regulations and programs?
And I realized I didn't give Sally a chance to answer the PFAS one, so I apologize if you want to circle back to that. Really quickly, Massachusetts did, and I have to find the article link because they did look into that a few years ago, and we have an article on it. I'm blanking, I apologize, but
Okay.
if Sally wants to answer that. But there's a really good study that the Institute for Local Self-Reliance did back in 2013, I think, called Pay Dirt. So if you just Google Pay Dirt, it has really good economic data, job creation data. And then most recently, a couple weeks ago, we had an article in Biocycle Connect on a study in Australia. And I think there's some you could do some crossover analysis. And I'll see if I can get that link real quick.
Good. I didn't realize Sally was on the call, but.
Oh, no, not Sally Brown, Sally Rowland, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's
The
Sally.
other Sally. No, I don't have anything to add. What Nora said is we're spot on.
Okay, well, this one maybe is for Sally Rowland then, about legislation mandating use of compost for, DOT type projects, for other site development or restoration and the like. Do you see the need for that, or when's that gonna join the diversion laws and regs?
We haven't seen any proposals in that realm. We've been working with our DOT and users over the years to make sure that's a possibility. It's already in the DOT specs that you can use compost, what it has to look like and all that. We think one of the potential avenues is really with the contractors, because DOT will tell you most of that kind of earthwork is done through contractors, not DOT directly. So it's getting, contractors comfortable with the material. So we've done it from more of an outreach perspective. We haven't seen anything in the legislature on a mandatory perspective.
Okay.
And Kendall, I just want to add, Christine mentioned, or somebody mentioned our top 10 composting trends. And one of the people we surveyed is Walter Willis in Illinois, who's with one of the solid waste authorities.
Yeah,
and,
Lake County.
Yeah, Lake County. And he was, they are very specific that the state passed a preferential procurement for state projects and using compost. And probably 10 plus 15 years ago, there was, so much interest in DOT use of compost. And one thing I neglected to mention, I had it in my notes, is the crystal ball, or that was the crystal ball, but it's a really good tool, is these model ordinances that communities and counties can adopt to require a certain amount of soil organic matter before occupying a new building occupation or home occupation. And it's an automatic slam dunk for compost. So these are not difficult, and they actually have economic benefits to the developers. There's a great buildingsoils.org website, has tons of information on that. And I'm putting the link to the jobs thing, Kendall, in the chat here.
Great. So I think we're about the end here. Christine, you want to end up with any final words about where people can find this? Remind people where they can find this webinar and the links after we're done.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kendall. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. I really hope that you were able to, attend at least one of the parts of the 3-part webinar series. We will be posting all of the recordings of the webinar and the presentations on the NYSAR 3 Organic Summit webpage. As I mentioned earlier, the first 2 webinars are already up there, so we'll be getting this one up in the coming week. And one thing I did forget to mention is we do, as part of our virtual experience for the Organic Summit, we do have a survey going on right now, and it's really to help people expand their networks and opportunities for collaboration. So in the survey, we ask you to share your contact information, and also to, fill out if you're looking for any partners on a specific project, or if you're able to offer a service to someone else. And then we'll be sharing that survey with those who also filled out the survey, so you can connect with one another and kind of recreate that feeling of meeting in person and exchanging business cards. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining, and we hope to see you next year at the 2021 New York State Organic Summit in Albany, New York, April 6th to April 7th. So thank you once again, everyone.